In the years after the Second World War, something shifted in how families lived together. It happened gradually enough that most people experienced it as simply modern life unfolding. There was no announcement, no moment when anyone decided that the old patterns would end. But by the time a generation had passed, the daily rhythms that had organized family life for centuries had been fundamentally altered. The change began with objects entering homes. Refrigerators became standard in the 1950s, which meant families no longer needed to shop for food daily or preserve meals using methods passed down through generations. Freezers allowed bulk purchasing. Packaged goods replaced items that had once required preparation from scratch. Each innovation was presented as liberation from drudgery, and in many ways it was. But these conveniences also severed small rituals that had previously required family members to coordinate, to be present at specific times, to share certain tasks. Television sets arrived in living rooms throughout the 1950s and early 1960s. At first, families gathered around them together, watching the same limited programming at scheduled times. This seemed like a new form of togetherness. But the technology was only beginning its work. By the 1970s, multiple televisions per household became common. Family members could now watch different programs in different rooms. The shared experience fragmented quietly, replaced by parallel but separate consumption. The physical layout of homes began to change as well. Older houses had been built with shared spaces at their center. Kitchens where families gathered, single living areas where different activities happened simultaneously. New construction favored separation. Children's bedrooms moved farther from common areas. Recreation rooms, dens, and bonus rooms proliferated. Each family member could claim territory, could retreat into privacy. The architecture itself encoded a different assumption about how people would relate to one another. Work patterns shifted in ways that rippled through everything else. The post-war economic expansion had initially promised that prosperity would mean more family time, that efficiency and automation would free people from excessive labor. For a period in the 1950s and early 1960s, this seemed possible. But by the 1970s, the trend reversed. Work hours began to creep upward, particularly as more households required two incomes to maintain middle-class status. The promised leisure never fully materialized. Instead, families found themselves coordinating increasingly complex schedules, with different members leaving and returning at different times. Most people didn't question these changes as they happened. Each shift seemed like a natural response to new possibilities, to economic pressures, to the rhythm of progress. Neighbors were making similar adjustments. Advice in magazines and on television programs normalized the new patterns. Schools extended their hours and added after-school activities, adapting to the reality that fewer parents were home in the afternoons. The infrastructure of daily life reorganized itself around the assumption that families would be more dispersed, more scheduled, more separated, even while living under the same roof. This wasn't discussed as a loss at the time. The language used to describe these changes emphasized choice, convenience, and individual freedom. Each family member having their own television was framed as abundance. Processed foods that required no group preparation were marketed as modern efficiency. Schedules packed with individual activities for children were presented as opportunities, as good parenting. The older patterns, daily shared meals that required coordination, evening hours spent in the same room with limited entertainment options, children playing in mixed age groups within walking distance of home, these weren't defended or mourned. They simply faded, replaced by arrangements that seemed more aligned with contemporary life. The meal pattern changed especially dramatically, though so gradually that many people didn't notice the full extent of the transformation. In earlier decades, the evening meal had functioned as an anchor point, a time when family members gathered regardless of what else was happening in their lives. This wasn't purely about nutrition, it was a daily ritual of assembly, a moment when information was shared, when conflicts surfaced and were addressed, when younger members observed how older members handled conversation and disagreement. The food itself was often simple, but the gathering was complex, serving multiple purposes beyond feeding. By the 1980s and 1990s, this pattern had been substantially disrupted. Microwaves made it possible for each family member to eat different food at different times. Drive-through restaurants normalized eating in cars, eating alone, eating while in transit between activities. School and work schedules became less predictable, with evening meetings, late activities, and shift work spreading across what had once been protected family time. The idea of a daily shared meal persisted as an ideal in cultural representations, but the actual practice became rarer. Families might manage it a few times a week, or primarily on weekends, or mainly during holidays. The real impact of these changes appeared years later, in patterns that weren't immediately connected to their causes. Researchers began documenting shifts in how children developed social skills, how they learned to read emotional cues and navigate disagreement. Skills that had once been absorbed through daily exposure to mixed-age family interactions now required explicit teaching in therapeutic or educational settings. Parents sought professional help for problems, difficulty with delayed gratification, inability to sustain attention, trouble managing conflict, that previous generations had rarely needed to address formally. By the time these consequences became visible, the habits were already deeply established. Families knew something felt different, that life seemed more fragmented and exhausting than it had for their parents, but the connection to specific structural changes remained unclear. The explanations offered tended to focus on individual failings, too much screen time, poor discipline, lack of willpower, rather than on how the entire system of family organization had been transformed. Communication patterns shifted in ways that were hard to measure but deeply felt. In earlier arrangements, family members had been forced into regular proximity. This created friction, certainly, but it also created opportunities for incidental conversation, for observing one another's moods and states, for developing what researchers would later call ambient awareness. When someone was struggling, others noticed through accumulated small signals over days. When tensions arose, they tended to surface and be addressed rather than accumulating in isolation. The newer patterns reduced these incidental contacts. Family members could live in the same house while following essentially separate schedules, intersecting only briefly for logistical coordination. Communication became more transactional, focused on schedules and requirements rather than open-ended exchange. Teenagers could be deeply troubled without parents having enough regular contact to notice. Marriages could deteriorate while couples maintained complex household operations, only recognizing the emotional distance after years had passed. These shifts weren't uniform across all communities or economic classes. Some families maintained older patterns either by choice or by necessity. Rural areas, immigrant communities, religious groups that emphasized family structure, these sometimes preserved practices that were fading in mainstream suburban culture. But the dominant trend moved toward greater fragmentation, more individual autonomy, less structured collective time. The commercial sector both responded to and accelerated these changes. Products were developed specifically to enable individual consumption. Personal music players, handheld gaming devices, eventually smartphones and tablets. Each innovation was marketed as freedom, as empowerment, as keeping up with modern life. And in isolation, each one was neutral, potentially positive. But the cumulative effect was to make shared attention increasingly rare, to make parallel but separate existence the default mode even among people living together. By the early 2000s, a counter-movement began to emerge. Parenting advice started emphasizing family dinners again, urging parents to protect this time against the encroachment of activities and devices. Research was cited showing correlations with regular family meals and various positive outcomes for children. But restoring the practice proved difficult. The entire infrastructure of schools, work, and children's activities had evolved to assume that families would be flexible, dispersed, available at all hours. Protecting shared time required swimming against strong currents, required privileging family meals over opportunities that might genuinely matter for children's futures. The challenge wasn't primarily about individual families making better choices. The structure itself had changed. Housing developments were built farther from workplaces, requiring longer commutes. School districts consolidated, increasing travel time for students. Extracurricular activities became more competitive and demanding, requiring frequent evening and weekend commitments. Economic pressures meant that many families needed multiple income streams, with parents working irregular hours or maintaining side businesses in addition to primary employment. Within this context, maintaining regular shared family time required extraordinary effort and often came with real costs. What had seemed like a collection of small conveniences and individual choices had accumulated into a fundamental reorganization of domestic life. Families still existed as legal and economic units, but the daily experiential reality of family life had been transformed. The question of whether this was progress or loss became contested, with passionate arguments on both sides, but the arguments often missed the point. The change had already happened. The infrastructure, the economy, the built environment, the social expectations, all of these had evolved to support and assume the newer patterns. Going back was not a matter of different choices. It would have required rebuilding systems that no longer existed. Some families managed to create islands of older practice within the new context. They protected dinner times, limited devices, structured their lives to allow for unscheduled shared time. But doing so required constant active resistance against default patterns, required significant resources of time and money, required the ability to opt out of competitive structures that other families were participating in. It was possible, but it was not easy, and it was not the path of least resistance. The children who grew up in the most fragmented environments, those who experienced family primarily through coordinated logistics rather than shared daily rhythms, began reaching adulthood in the 2000s and 2010s. Some researchers started noticing patterns in this cohort: higher reported rates of anxiety and depression, greater difficulty forming and maintaining relationships, a sense of having been overscheduled and over-monitored as children while somehow being fundamentally alone. Not universal experiences, but common enough to suggest something structural rather than individual. These young adults often struggled to articulate exactly what they felt they'd missed. They had been provided with opportunities, with resources, with attention from adults, but the older form of family life, messy, unscheduled, forced together by necessity rather than choice, had largely disappeared from their experience. They knew it through cultural representations, through stories their grandparents told, but not through lived memory. And yet some sense of absence persisted, a feeling that something that should have been there wasn't. The language available to discuss these changes remained inadequate. Terms like family values had been captured by political rhetoric and no longer described concrete practices. Nostalgia for the past was easily dismissed as romanticization, as forgetting the very real limitations and oppressions that had existed in earlier family structures. And those limitations were real. The older patterns had often been sustained through rigid gender roles, through economic dependence, through social pressure that constrained individual freedom. The change wasn't purely loss, but neither was it purely gain. What remained difficult to discuss openly was the possibility that something essential had been traded away, not through anyone's deliberate decision, but through accumulated structural shifts that no one had full control over. The promise had been that technology and economic progress would make family life easier, would free people from drudgery, and create more time for genuine connection. But the reality that emerged was often the opposite: more complexity, more scheduling demands, more separation despite physical proximity. By the 2010s, the pattern had become self-perpetuating. The infrastructure assumed separated schedules. The economy rewarded constant availability and flexibility. The educational system required parental involvement that was expensive but fragmented. The built environment was designed for cars and individual transport rather than walking and casual neighbor interaction. Reversing any single element of this pattern ran into conflicts with every other element. The system had locked into a configuration that sustained itself. The changes weren't finished. New technologies continued to alter the landscape of family interaction. Social media created parallel digital lives that could be maintained even while physically present with others. Streaming services eliminated the last remnants of shared programming schedules. Remote work, accelerated by pandemic pressures, further blurred the boundaries between domestic space and workspace. Each shift was presented as increasing flexibility and choice, and in some ways it did. But the cumulative effect continued to erode the conditions that had once made shared family life the default rather than an achievement. The pattern didn't appear only in families. Similar dynamics transformed other forms of community: neighborhoods, religious congregations, civic organizations. The structures that had once held people in regular, somewhat obligatory contact with one another loosened. This was experienced as liberation from provincial constraints, from enforced conformity, from the tyranny of local opinion. And those benefits were genuine. But the loss of forced contact also meant the loss of certain kinds of knowledge, certain skills that had been transmitted through proximity and repetition rather than through formal teaching. What replaced these organic transmission systems often proved inadequate. Therapy, self-help books, online advice, these could provide information, but they couldn't fully replicate the ambient learning that happened through sustained immersion in functioning social groups. Young people increasingly reported feeling that they had to figure out basic life skills: how to maintain friendships, how to navigate conflict, how to sustain commitment without adequate models or support. The information was available, but the embodied practice was missing. The feeling many people described was of living in a system that worked efficiently on its own terms, but failed to support what humans actually needed. The infrastructure successfully moved people between work and home and activities. The economy successfully generated consumption. The technology successfully delivered content and maintained connections across distance. But the daily experience felt increasingly hollow, fragmented, exhausting in ways that efficiency and convenience were supposed to alleviate. Some families recognized this and attempted to rebuild older patterns within the new context. They moved to walkable neighborhoods, reduced their commitments, prioritized shared meals, limited technology. These efforts sometimes succeeded in creating something valuable, but they remained individual solutions to structural problems. The families that managed it tended to be those with resources, time flexibility, enough income to not require maximum economic optimization, social capital to create alternative community structures. For families without those resources, the default patterns remained difficult to escape. And this wasn't the only change. Similar structural shifts had transformed how people ate, how they moved through space, how they learned, how they worked. Each transformation followed similar patterns: initial promises of liberation and efficiency, Gradual normalization of new practices, eventual recognition of unexpected costs, attempts to recover what had been lost, running up against infrastructure that had already adapted to the new reality. The pattern didn't stop with families.